Welcome into the I-80 Boys College Football Show. As always, I'm one of the co-hosts here, Christian Hunt, and that guy right over there is
Chris Vaca. How's it going, guys? Christian, how you been? A lot of drama, my man, in college football currently. Players leaving, coaches signing new deals, coaches stepping down.
It's
crazy,
Chris.
dude. Crazy.
What's that old saying? Just when I'm out, you bring me right back in. Just when we were getting ready to take sort of a month or two sabbatical from college football, talking about it. One of the biggest stories to probably break college football in the last couple of years, Nick Saban retires, right? And then over the last 3 days, I mean, this has been just pretty much nuts. I mean, any and every, and like we said, when we broke this down first, Chris, one of the things we talked about was, one of the things we talked about was every name under the sun was going to get thrown out there, from Tommy Rees down to Bill Belichick. Right now, a lot of people laugh at that, but I mean, if DeBoer probably would have turned it down, I think Tommy Rees probably would have moved a lot higher up on that list than a lot of people really would have realized. Chris, Kalen DeBoer, former Washington coach, named the head coach at Alabama. Chris, what's your thoughts on it just out of the gate here?
I don't like the hire. I'm just going to say that. I know people are going to say, well, he's great. His record, which is in front of us right here, is crazy. A lot of those wins, though, by the way, were at Sioux Falls, not too far away from here where I live. The reason why I don't love the hire is because he doesn't really have any ties to the South. He's a West Coast guy. He's been over there. He had a hell of a year this year with Washington. I think he's a really good coach. I just don't know if he fits the demeanor of what Bama wants, though. Bama's. I know Saban, and nobody is ever going to be Nick Saban. I would never want to be the guy to follow Nick Saban. It's impossible. It doesn't matter what Kalen DeBoer does now. I don't know, man. I don't love the hire. I think there were some other guys out there that I would have pressed a little bit harder. I know they wanted Dan Lanning. You can debate me all day long, but Dan Lanning looks like he's pretty comfortable in Oregon. And Christian, what's your thoughts on this hire too, though? I mean, I'd like to hear your thoughts. We haven't talked about this at all, really. What do you think?
Chris, I kept trying to search myself to really figure how I felt about this, right? I'm going to throw this out there. As a Georgia fan, the guy that scared me the most that was floated out there for a minute, and there was like a 12-hour period where it thought, people were thinking it was a done deal, Dan Lanning, right? He's a mix of Kirby and Saban. He can recruit with the best of them. I think he's a great coach. He's young. He's 10 years younger than Kirby. So to me, that's what's so terrifying about it is, this guy, bringing him to a team like Alabama, that would be terrifying. The DeBoer hire itself, I really was trying to figure out how I felt about this, Chris, and I think I just figured it out when you were talking there. You know what he reminds me of, Chris? We talk about this all the time, right? He's a Midwest 8. He's a California 4. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Well, what I mean by that is, a Midwest 8, right? They're pretty by comparison, right? His resume looks really good. He's won, he's Miss Wisconsin. You know what I mean? He looks great, but he just isn't on that same level as some of those, those world beauties that we see right there, right? Somebody told me, and I saw a tweet that I think perfectly encapsulates this, right? He's not Mike Shula. He's not Mike Shula bad, but he's probably not going to be Nick Saban good either, or great.
Right.
He's going to
Nick Saban great, though.
Right now,
Dan Lanning?
I mean, I would say Dan Lanning has that potential, right? The upside of Dan Lanning has that potential, I think. Kirby Smart, has that potential to be Nick Saban great. I mean, you got to think about this. Kirby has 2 championships right now. Really, there's nobody stopping him other than maybe Jim Harbaugh at the moment from really taking over the sport, I would say, right? So there's... Kirby he's 48 years old. So let's say he coaches till he's 60. That's 12 more years. To catch up with Saban, he's probably going to have to get, another 4 or 5 championships?
Saban's got 6 with Alabama.
Yeah, 6 with Alabama. So, I mean, he would have to, in the next, however many years, he would have to probably win at least 4 or 5 more championships to really get on that same level as a head coach and be in that same breath, I think, as Saban. Outside of that, though, yeah, I mean, there's really, and that's the thing we talk about, right? What Saban is a once in a generational coach, right? You know, the Tom Osbornes of the world, the Bobby Bowdens, some of those guys that we kind of hold in revered breath, the Bear Bryants, those guys, right? They don't come along too often. And you got to think about where Alabama was at when Saban took over that program, right? Between Bear Bryant and Nick Saban, right, which I think was about a 20-year or so period, if I'm not mistaken, maybe a little more than that, give or take.
A little longer than that, but yeah.
And it was like a 30-year period. I think it was about 30 years or so, give or take. Alabama won one national title in that time, right? And the program was starting to decline, if I'm not mistaken, when Saban took over. And so Saban built it back to what it is today. And a lot of people are saying, well, it's Alabama. And I don't, that doesn't really mean much because it's Saban, right? Saban was the one that built that program. You take Saban away. Now Kalen DeBoer comes in, and his next steps, let's just be honest, Chris, his next steps have got to be roster management, keeping this roster intact while also, being able to recruit now, looking towards the future. My big question is what his success is going to be predicated on is going to be how much of this roster can he keep in place. And by the way, we're not even talking about the fact that this probably was Nick Saban's best coaching job, right? Because
I think so.
And you talk about it all the time, Chris. I mean, Jalen Milroe, I think, and everybody talks about it, he had some decent games this year, I felt like, but I really think the running game and the defense kind of carried him. The receivers I thought were pretty good this year. They took a step forward. Milroe had some games where he flashed, but he also had some games where he disappointed too, where they just could not throw the ball. They had to really rely on his legs, his ability to move the pocket, and make things happen. You look at a guy like DeBoer and what his system is, that's not his system at all. No. His system is more, up-tempo, let's throw the ball, let's kind of hand it off, kind of that West Coast sort of style, if you will. Night and day different here. I don't think going into it, they might struggle and they could lose some games doing this because this isn't the Pac-12, this isn't the Mountain West, and it's not NAIA, right? He's never been at this level. Now, he did take a Washington team with, let's just be honest, not that great a talent comparatively to the playoffs last year. And he was maybe one really good quarter away from winning a national title, his second year at a program, which I think is pretty good.
Yeah. No, I mean, you're right about most of that. It just feels with this hire, I just don't, like you said, we talked about it right away there. It's like, I just don't feel like Kalen, like demeanor wise and just personality wise, really fits in with Bama. And like I said, it doesn't mean that I don't think he's going to be successful. Problem is Bama's probably, other than Georgia right now, if you don't make the playoffs, or you're actually better yet, if you don't compete for the national championship, it's a failed season. I mean, it is. There's only a few teams in the country that can honestly say they have those kind of expectations, Christian. And Alabama is definitely one of them. It's just going to be tough for him no matter what he does. And the state of that fan base, I guarantee we're going to, if Bama goes out next year and loses 3 or 4 games, Christian, which is a possibility with the turnover in the roster and all that. You know how many times we're going to hear is this name is going to be floated around every 5 minutes on ESPN. Is Kalen DeBoer, is he really the answer? A tough year in Tuscaloosa. You know what I mean? It's going to be tough, man. And yes, I do play the other side of the coin here. Who were they going to get? Like I said, I think they did want Dan Lanning. I know I would be if I was in Alabama's shoes. Unfortunately, you're not going to get him, right? There was one guy, and you said this before we got on, and you know who I'm referring to here, that did not get any traction. It's kind of weird, and I don't know why not, was Urban Meyer.
Yeah.
I'm not convinced he's done coaching yet. Now, you know my thoughts on Urban Meyer. I think he's a piece of shit, personally. But The guy has been a great coach wherever he's went. He is an incredible recruiter. He's one of the best recruiters of all time. I don't know why his name didn't get floated around. Maybe he, I know he says things every year why he's not coaching, right? It's the heart, it's this, it's that, it's everything else under the sun. But Christian, I mean, did it surprise you that Urban Meyer's name wasn't thrown out there?
I think it surprised me a little bit, right? Because, I mean, look, with a lot of Alabama fans and a lot of just college football fans in general would think it's because it's been floated out there, right? It's the ESPN narrative that they still want to keep pushing down everybody's throats. And that is Alabama, it's a premier job, right? It's a premier job. So they should get the best coach out there. Now, the upside of a Kalen DeBoer, right? The fact that he has 3 NAIA championships is pretty good. The fact that he's 104-12 is pretty good. But has he proven it at this level? That's the big question. He made it to the playoffs. He's a hot name. I tell you, Chris, the hire to me could be very interesting in that, another guy that got hired in the state of Alabama not that long ago was Brian Harsin. Brian Harsin had a damn good record. It wasn't like this, but he had a damn good record, coming into it. He was another West Coast guy at Boise State that I think his record was, 89-36. Now that was after the Auburn tenure, so he probably lost I think it was 10 games, something like that, there. So he was, whatever he was in 26 before he got to Auburn. So, but it didn't work out, and they ran him off after about a season and a half there at Auburn. And I'm curious, what I mean? There's no ties to the South here. He's won. I don't know, Chris. I mean, to me, it seems like, and there's a lot of speculation. I know a lot of people are going to throw out a lot of different things here. They're going to say, you guys are just Alabama haters. Well, yeah, I'm a Georgia fan, and I'll be honest, I've been waiting for Saban to retire since about 08-09. But other than that, you know what I mean? If Alabama really is the premier job, you would think they would have somebody. They would have gotten somebody that, was either a Dan Lanning, or a Urban Meyer that has that championship pedigree to follow up Nick Saban, right? And again, the thing with Lanning is the potential that he's going to be. He's cutting that same cloth. It almost seems like they've kind of gone away from that, right? Saban obviously was a defensive whiz,
Yep.
DeBoer, if I'm not mistaken, he's an offensive guy, right?
Yep.
And my question is, Chris, is this we couldn't get the other guys on that list? Because like you said, I mean, there were some other guys on that list. Now, Steve Sarkisian, right? Lane Kiffin, Dan Lanning, Mike Norvell. I mean, Dabo Swinney probably was a name that was loosely being thrown around there. Now, it didn't get down to the point where it was really bad. Like, Bama wasn't down bad enough to go out and hire Tommy Rees as their next coach. That would have been like the ultimate, oh shit, nobody wants this job.
Yeah.
But, and I know a lot of conspiracy theories have been thrown out there about, well, this is all Jimmy Sexton, that agent that kind of represents all the major coaches in college football, trying to get all his clients a big payday. And this was all orchestrated, and DeBoer was really the guy. Listen, we can sit there and do that all day long. To me, there's a certain physicality, right? There's a certain physicality that I want to see. Like, we talk about this, right? Like Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss and LSU with Brian Kelly, right? They, on defense this year especially, lack that physicality. And we saw what happened with it. And if you start looking at where Alabama could go, because here's another thing we talked about, right? I talked about this a little bit earlier on, right? What happens now with the transfer portal? We've already seen Isaiah Bond. We've already seen a 5-star wide receiver. I think it was Ryan Williams, his name, if I'm not mistaken. He decommitted like an hour after Nick Saban said he was retiring from that class. Wasn't, he was committed. I don't think he signed his letter of intent, so he was just like, nope, I'm out. I'm done. How much more roster turnover are we going to see from this? That's the question I want to see.
Yeah, I think you're going to get quite a bit. I was reading something, though. They said it probably, there's going to be people that get out of here, but you have to put in your transfer papers. They said the year after this year will be even worse because kids have already started classes. So you can't just up and out that way since this was so late, you know what I mean, in Saban retiring. So they said that'll definitely have something to do with it, too, in the next year in 2025, right? I don't know, man. I want to ask Kirtley what they got on their roster because you said, Burton's gone, Bond's gone. What are they going to do with Jalen Milroe? We haven't touched on this yet. Jalen Milroe is a tremendous athlete. He is. He's crazy. He'd win a lot of underwear Olympics. He really would. But the problem is he's not an elite passer of the ball by any means. We saw that against a good defense against Michigan pretty much all year, really. He does throw a good deep ball. We've talked about that. But DeBoer's an offensive-minded guy. He, from this looks at things, he loves to throw the ball 45, 50 times a game at times. And he does run the football, don't get me wrong. But what are you going to do with Milroe? Like, is he going to bring in one of his guys, Christian? We talked about Will Rogers. He committed to Washington. Now just saw that he's transferring out of there. I mean, does he go to Bama? And we know what he did at Mississippi State under Leach. When Leach was there, he likes to throw the football. That's a big question to me, especially 2024 Alabama this year. What are they going to do at quarterback? I mean, yeah, you can use Milroe, you can, but he cannot throw the ball like that. He is not going to get that much better throwing the ball that many times a game like Penix did, or some of these other guys that like to sling the rock.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Chris. I mean, like you said, I mean, he wants to run that, that Odinese, that, what was his name? McMillan? Was that the other one?
Polk, three of those.
Polk. Yeah. I mean, they had three really good wide receivers. I'm not saying Alabama doesn't have talent. Obviously, they're going to have more talent than most teams, but, that talent committed for Nick Saban, right? They didn't sign up to play for, Kalen DeBoer. The other side of this, and I think it's kind of interesting, Chris, is we're talking about DeBoer here. You look at his recruiting classes that he put together while he was at Washington. This year, he had the number 41 ranked recruiting class. I don't care who you are at a major SEC program, that won't fly. No. Right? There's too many great teams out there. Now, I know the argument that's going to be thrown out there is, well, look at what they did, going up against Oregon. They've owned Oregon, right? And Dan Lanning, and the guy that you said was the number one to get this job. And I get that, right? Dan Lanning, he beat Sarkisian. I mean, he did a great job against those guys. I think he was undefeated against Sark and Lanning. My question is, what's that going to look like when you go up against a guy that's, I think, cut from a similar cloth and is making really big strides, on that side of the ball? Can you still see me? Oh, sorry, my monitor kind of cut off there. Oh. Anyways, what's that going to look like when you go up against a guy like Lane Kiffin? What's that going to look like when you go up against a guy in Hugh Freeze who's getting better, and a guy in Brian Kelly, who's going to be improving that defense? I mean, they're all going out of their way, it seems like, to I think the SEC West, and this is where I'm going to say this here, and I'll turn it back over to you, Chris, they are leveling that playing field.
Right. No, you're not wrong. It's going to be tough, man, because, DeBoer does have this crazy outstanding record, but going to the SEC, and nobody's going to convince me. If you want to type about it, go right ahead in the comment section. The SEC is the best conference, dude. It shows year in and year out since the 2000s, dude. They dominate. I think teams like Kentucky, Ole Miss, LSU this year would beat a majority of top-tier contending teams in any conference, whether that's the Oregons, the Washingtons. I think they would compete with them. I really do. Whether it's Michigan, Ohio State, or Penn State, whether it's Florida State or, Louisville. I mean, Texas, any of those schools, I think they would play. Not necessarily Kentucky, but I'll throw Ole Miss out there in some of those schools. The SEC is tough, man. It really is. And I think it's going to be tough for DeBoer, man. I do. And you said that. What are you going to do this year? And, you look, and I mentioned this to you the other day. I said, recruiting, right, is a huge thing. I believe it's probably 75, 80% of what makes a college program successful. And it starts with the head coach. Is DeBoer's a West Coast guy, Midwest guy, whatever you want to call him. There are very few players on Alabama's team from California in that West Coast. That is going to be tough. How are you going to bring players? I'm not saying he's not going to get kids from down south, but I don't think you're going to get the majority of kids that most people would think, right? I mean, if you're out in California, I'm going to go play for Lincoln Riley and USC. I'm going to go play for Dan Lanning in Oregon. It's right up the road, right? I just don't see how this, like I said, I don't think this is a terrible hire. Please don't get that wrong. I understand that you got to have somebody in there. I'm just not 100% sold that Kalen DeBoer is going to be super successful at Alabama, or what most people think Alabama should be year in, year out. from here on out.
Exactly. And I think the thing with a guy like Jalen Milroe is he's propped up with all the talent that's around him, right? I mean, that's the big thing. He looked really good because I think Alabama is really talented. I mean, that is the thing that is diminished. I mean, and it was Saban. Saban did a fantastic job, I think, at sort of coaching around all these things because he's seen it before. I mean, he's had, not to knock him off here, he's had a Blake Sims. I mean, when he started, he came up in the game. The quarterback was the worst position in the Alabama offense, hands down.
And they won titles that way with not very good quarterbacks that most of us can't name.
He won more titles with bad quarterbacks than he did with good quarterbacks, Chris. That's that's insane. I mean, that speaks to Saban and part of how good of a coach he was. Looking at this and looking at what Alabama loses from a production standpoint, Jace McClellan, he's gone to the draft this year, their top rusher. Roydell Williams is in the transfer portal. He's gone. That's a big thing right there. So obviously Milroe had 531 yards, but then you got Jam Miller and Justice Haynes in there, young guys that are going to be looked to sort of carry that load for him, if I'm not mistaken. Then we look at the wide receivers here for a second. And this is where things get a lot crazier for me because Jermaine Burton and Isaiah Bond, your leading receivers that accounted for 12 touchdowns, they're gone. Let's take a look here. I want to see about this tight end here.
The big one's a wide receiver position, man. They lose a lot of production there with those two guys. That was pretty much their two receivers all year. Kobe Prentice is not bad, but he's young. But they're going to need some guys to step up, Christian, let alone they're going to need some guys. I don't know whether it's transfer portal, recruiting, whatever. I mean, Bama's been known to put out wide receivers. Like it was wide receiver U there with Ohio State for quite a few years there. And Kalen DeBoer had the same problem there. And it's not a problem at Washington, right? I mean, he had those 3 elite receivers the last 2 years. You saw what they did there as far as production goes as well. I mean, Rome Odunze, in my opinion, could have been the wide receiver who won the Blitnikoff this year. He was just as good as Marvin Harrison. He actually had better stats, believe it or not. I know Harrison's more talented and everybody talks him up, but Odunze was really good. He had a hell of a year.
Oh, yeah. I mean, like you said, Chris, he had a hell of a year. Now, the good thing about this is, I mean, right now, Caleb Downs, by the way, true freshman coming in, playing safety, led the team in tackles with 107 tackles. I mean, that's fantastic. The problem is his name right now is being heavily linked to the transfer portal. Really, it's being thrown around with Ohio State is kind of the name. Now, that doesn't mean he's going to jump in the portal. He could still come back. Saban could, do everything he can to try to keep some of these guys in place here. The big thing, though, I think, and it shouldn't be minimized, is a ton of their best defensive players are already out. You know what I mean? So assuming you lose Caleb Downs, I mean, Deontay Lawson and Jihad Campbell, those were their 2 backers right there. They're coming back this year, so that's good for them. Terry and Arnold, if I'm not mistaken, he's going to the draft. He's already declared for the draft, right?
Yep.
Let me make sure about that real quick.
I
know.
The one stud they had, Christian, that declared
Dallas Turner.
Right after the freaking game.
Yeah, Dallas Turner. He's already declared for the draft. So I mean that's a big thing there. Here's what I think. Yeah, he's going to the draft if I'm not mistaken. Let's see. Yeah, so Braswell and Turner are both gone. So is McKinstry. I mean, they're losing a ton on the defensive side of the ball. I think we expected them anyways, Chris. With hiring an offensive-minded guy coming in here, I think we expect them to take a step back. I mean, I know last year Washington's defense this last season wasn't terrible, but the year prior to that, I mean, they got gashed, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, they were terrible for Nick Saban standards the year before.
I mean, sorry, the Washington side of things. I'm talking about for DeBoer. Wasn't Washington's defense like 2 years ago? They were really bad, weren't they?
Yeah, Washington was like a 4-8 team a couple of years ago.
Well, I mean, I think his first year, because I remember we were talking about this offseason, right? We had a lot of Washington fans that were telling us, well, no, their defense is going to be a lot better this year. Last year, because they were like 100 and something, I think, at defending the pass, or they were really bad, if I'm not mistaken, on the defensive side of the ball. And so I say all that basically to say I have a very strong feeling that DeBoer and this Alabama team defensively, I don't think he's going to be able to keep that same standard that Nick Saban demands up there. And I also think that we're talking about the offense here. It's going to probably be some growing pains too, right?
Yeah, it's going to be. Like I said, would it surprise you this year? And we haven't dug into Bama's schedule yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if they have a 9-3, 8-4 type of season, Christian. I wouldn't. I think it'd be hard even. I mean, even if Saban came back this year, I still think it'd be pretty tough for Bama again. You know what I mean? Just with what they had, what they're losing on the defensive side of the ball. This team this year was predominantly a defensive team. I think most people would agree. Milroe was pretty much 99% of their offense. Bama didn't run the ball from the running back position really that well compared to years prior with Saban. And I just think with DeBoer, man, it's going to be tough. The turnover is going to be hard. It's going to take a few years. I mean, they're going to have to give the guy some time, and you're going to have that one side of the fan base or Bama fans saying, oh, this was a terrible hire. Get rid of the guy after they do go 8-4 or something like that this coming year, 9-3, whatever it is. I could see that coming too. It's just going to be tough, man. This is like I said, with Saban, when we found out he stepped down, I was like, man, the first thing comes to mind is like, holy shit, I wouldn't want to follow Saban. That's tough, man.
It's like being a stand-up comedian and trying to follow someone that just murders like right before you do, and you're like, oh, I don't want to follow that. Even your best material is still not going to be that good. Like 8-4 at majority of the programs in the country. Oh. That's not a terrible season. Hell, 9-3 might even get you into the playoffs now.
9-3 will, yeah, probably.
And their schedule's not like a murderer's row. Like Nick Saban's coaching this, I probably have no worries here. Kalen DeBoer coming in his first year. I mean, Western Kentucky, South Florida, that should be 2 automatic dubs, right?
Yes.
All right. Now, Wisconsin, it's at Wisconsin. That game gets a little interesting to me, right?
I think you still lean Alabama regardless because of Wisconsin's year this year. Wisconsin did not impress me at all, and I'm a big Luke Fickell guy. If anybody follows the show, Christian and I was really high on Wisconsin. They do bring in Van Dyke at quarterback. They will be better, but I could see that game being close. Wisconsin did play LSU close in the bowl game not too long ago here, but that was this year or last year, if you want to say now. And would you lean Bama in this game though, Christian? Just from what you saw, you were not near as high on Wisconsin as I was this year.
I think if this game is like off the dome, you know what I mean? It's the first game of the year. It's like a Chick-fil-A kickoff, whatever the hell you want to call it, kickoff game. Maybe, yeah. But I mean, Luke Fickell in his own right, he's a damn good coach.
He is.
And it's his second year. I would still have to lean Alabama in that game. Now the season starts September 28th, right? If you really want to say that. That's the game where we're going to see, is it Bama? Is Kirby's got Kirby's number, or was it Nick Saban? I think obviously we talked about Nick Saban, but this is a game that I expect Kirby and them to win, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with that, right? Because there's so many things, and we're not breaking down what's going to happen yet. This isn't an official prediction video. We're just kind of looking through the schedule, just giving you our blind take from 45,000 feet above here. Because let's be honest, there's a lot of roster movement that's going to happen between now and then. You got guys that are going to jump out of this Alabama team, and you got guys that are probably going to join the Alabama team. Chris, a guy that DeBoer recruited and was able to land in the portal was Will Rogers. I think he's the all-time SEC leading passer, if I'm not mistaken, right?
He's got some pretty crazy numbers at Mississippi State.
Would it shock you if he brought in Will Rogers? He was able to get Will Rogers to...
Would you take Will Rogers and probably DeBoer's offense over Jalen Milroe? I mean, he fits the bill a lot better.
I'll tell you right now, if Will Rogers somehow ends up, or like let's say Cam Ward. Okay, I'm going to throw another name out here at you. Let's say a guy like Cam Ward decides to, because he declared for the NFL draft. I don't know if he's serious about that. I don't know, whatever have you. He may, and I don't know if it's too late yet or not. What if he decides to, I'm gonna step back, I'm gonna come back, maybe I'm gonna go play for DeBoer out there at at Alabama. If Bama brings in a halfway competent quarterback, I want to say Milroe's gonna jump ship.
I would Me personally, just with Will Rogers leaving, a couple days ago or yesterday, whatever it was, transferring out of Washington, I'm assuming he's going to Bama. I find it very hard to believe he's going to go sit on the bench.
Yeah. And it depends. I mean, we see this all the time with the transfer portal, right? Where a kid decides, I'm going to get out of the portal. Maybe I was highly recruited by XYZ team, and they end up going somewhere completely different, right? Where it's not necessarily their second choice or the coach that recruited them. They just are looking at the situation from a different standpoint. I mean, some other games on this schedule here that might get interesting at Tennessee. Imalivia is going to be on there. He might look to do some things by that point. Midway point of the season, October 19th. It's a road game. That'll be a good environment. They're playing at LSU. That'll be an interesting environment. They're playing Mizzou. Mizzou's going to be a good one. At Oklahoma versus Auburn, the Iron Bowl. These are all really good matchups this year. And, again, like we talked about, Saban coming in, last year's team was pretty young. Saban probably keeps a good chunk of this roster together, the core group of it together anyways. Some of these games probably not going to be an issue for him, right? But now with DeBoer trying to come in, run a new system, I would assume Reese is probably going to be out.
I would think so. I think DeBoer's going to bring most of his guys, or would like to bring most of his guys. I don't know about Ryan Grubb. That guy's probably going to find a head coaching job, isn't he? I mean, he was talked about a lot up until the title game.
There's a chance Ryan Grubb ends up taking over for Washington.
That's what I mean. Yeah,
ends up just being named the coach. I mean, it'll probably be a short list of guys on that Washington list right now. I mean, another name to throw out there for, we'll stop right here for a second and we'll just talk about Washington, and that is, what about Pete Carroll? Pete Carroll's looking for a job. I know he's a tweener, right? Where he can be successful at college and he can be successful in the NFL. I mean,
Pete Carroll's an interesting one. I still think he stays in the NFL. But, boy, he does. His biggest thing why people love him is because he relates to young players. He's kind of a kid. You ever seen him on the sideline? Hell, the guy's like 70. And he's out there. He's a goofball. Players love him, though. That's an interesting one, though. Washington wouldn't be a bad gig if you did go back to – he likes the West Coast. That's where he's been his whole life, whether it was with Seattle or USC. I could see that, though. Like, if Washington could entice him, I know they'll be playing in the Big Ten next year. But Pete Carroll's been around a long time. He is a damn good coach. He's a good NFL coach, too.
My question, Chris, is how we're going to find out very shortly, I have a feeling. How much stock are you putting in Ryan Grubb? Ryan Grubb, I think he's been with DeBoer for a while.
Yeah, he's pretty much followed him. I think he's followed him around since his days at Sioux Falls, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Let me look here, Christian. I'm with you. I think if I'm Washington, I'm trying to hire him as my head coach. He knows the system. He's been there. He obviously knows how to work with quarterbacks, right? He did a hell of a job with Penix. I watched a lot of Michael Penix at Indiana. Yes, he was hurt, but he made him a totally different player and a way more accurate quarterback when he was in Washington. And DeBoer said that. He said, he goes, I credit, Grubb for working with him and put Michael Penix had one of the best seasons of all time this year. So I could see that. Yeah, I take that back. Ryan Grubb, that's crazy. He was at SDSU in South Dakota. So they were close. And then he coached at Sioux Falls for a couple years there with DeBoer. You know what I mean? And then he went to Fresno State with him. So you're right. He's followed him around essentially wherever he's gone. If I'm Washington, I'd probably try to get him, because that was a question I wanted to ask Christian was, who fills in at Washington, right? Washington's still going to be a good team. I know they're going to the Big Ten, but they're going to compete in the Big Ten. I don't see how they don't with that program, the roster that they have. They've been able to recruit relatively well, not elite, but you don't have to have an elite class to be a really good team. We see that. Look at A&M every year. They have an elite class. They can't even make a bowl game.
Yeah, I think it becomes interesting. I mean, if it were me and I'm Washington now that DeBoer's gone to Bama, I would probably turn it over to Ryan Grubb, right? I mean, that would make the most logical sense. He's an in-house guy, right, which now puts more of that question onto, Alabama and that offense, right? Is without Ryan Grubb, we're going to get a chance to see here, because he's been the offensive coordinator pretty much following in DeBoer's footsteps since 2019, and he's followed him around pretty much everywhere.
Yep.
I mean, their resume is very similar on paper. Obviously, they've been at the same places. So, yeah, I don't know, man. I think when we're talking about Bama here, where this transitions to Bama and what this means, I want to say they're going to probably try to go after Will Rogers. I mean, that was the guy. He committed to him in that offense. He jumped right in the portal, which tells me it was DeBoer that had a bigger impact on him than Grubbs. I mean, he didn't even say, "Hey, I'm going to stay." Now, it's not saying they can't name Grubb the offensive or the head coach there, and Will Rogers can't take his name out of the portal. It just seems a little suspect that he takes the job and then immediately jumps.
Right, and you would say that one thing about Will Rogers, if he does go to Alabama to follow DeBoer, Will Rogers has played in the SEC. He understands the SEC defenses. He was, if you guys don't know, the kid had a incredibly great year under Mike Leach there a couple years ago. Rest in peace, Mike Leach, by the way. But he had a really good year that year. I think he led the SEC in passing, if I'm not mistaken, that year in yards. I mean, the guy, and they did throw the ball like Mike Leach always does, 60, 70 times per game with that, run and shoot or whatever the hell they call that offense. But I could see that. I like I said, what's that? I don't know what that does for Jalen Milroe. I think Jalen Milroe is a starter, obviously, but I mean, at a lot of programs, you're going to have to fit his bill, kind of like what the Ravens do with Lamar Jackson, right? I mean, you're going to have some sort of offense where Milroe can use his legs and his ability to extend plays in the pocket.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Chris. I mean, this is getting nuts here. A couple big losses here for Alabama. Des Ricks, I think he was up there. I mean, he played a little bit last year, if I'm not mistaken, with the Crimson Tide. So cornerback there, he's already jumped in the portal. By the way, it's so weird because you look at this, and pretty much a lot of these guys is Washington and Alabama over the last couple of days. They're the ones that have jumped in the portal here. So that's pretty interesting to me. I think Ricks was one of the guys they were probably looking at to be a contributor this year on that side of it. Now, another interesting thing was, I think it was Travarius Robinson, who was the defensive backs coach. That was a guy that, with Kevin Steele retiring, that was a name that they were talking about potentially stepping up, and being the defensive coordinator. He is now, as we've been on here, they've just announced it. He is going over to Georgia to be the co-defensive coordinator there with Glenn Schumann. Will Muschamp is, taking a step back. I think he's still going to be with the University of Georgia. He's going to be in more of an off-the-field role there. So that's pretty interesting. It's a big win for Georgia. Pretty big loss, I think, for, DeBoer and Alabama.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting, man. They're going to have a whole new coaching tree there. I would assume, and you said it earlier, that what's his bucket, the offensive coordinator for Bama, the guy, Tommy Reed. I mean, he's going to be looking for a new job, right? I mean, I just don't see it. I was never impressed with him anyway, in the scheme that Alabama run offensively. I know they didn't have Bryce Young back there, a quarterback, or Tua or Jalen Hurts. I get that, but their offense is kind of what hurt them this year, in certain games. They couldn't put up enough points at times and became stagnant. But I would assume that he's out the door, right, Christian?
I'd have to assume so. Yeah. I mean, there might be like a grad assistant or somebody on that staff, an assistant coach that he might probably bring with him and give another shot, kind of like he did with Ryan Grubb, I should say. DeBoer will. Like I said, I mean, this is going to be very interesting, right? Because there's a lot of question marks. I expect there to be a big turnover, as far as the Nick Saban recruited players at Alabama this year. Alabama could look completely different, and that's the crazy thing to me. Speaking of that, what do you guys think about the hire? How would you grade it? What do you think about the Washington moves here? The whole landscape of college football, I think, is now getting shaken up, and it feels, Chris, it's something we've talked about. It feels very late for this to be happening, right? The difference between December and almost mid-January of trying to replace a coach, have roster management, all these things, put a staff together, it seems kind of late. Now, in the grand scheme of things, I mean, there's obviously, there's still 7-8 months before the season actually kicks back off again, so there's a ton of time, but not a whole lot, really. I mean, February, National Signing Day is right around the corner for us. You also have, spring ball that'll start shortly after that. I mean, there's a whole lot of things that are getting ready to happen here. It almost feels like, we're seeing a shifting of the tide here, in which a lot of these Bama players that were very talented in their own right are going to end up jumping ship, and they're end up going to go to some more major programs there, right? Where we're seeing the end of a monopoly almost, right? Where it's cannibalizing itself, to where the LSUs and the Ole Misses of the world and the Texas A&Ms of the world, they end up winning from this. Florida State is probably going to be a big benefit of this, because they're getting a lot of these Alabama players. Georgia now, right? The last domino that was really standing in Kirby's way, I think, from taking over college football was Saban in Alabama. I mean, Saban had his number. He was 5-1 against him. So I'm going to be excited to see that fourth game of the season when Alabama takes on Georgia. That's going to be the fun thing here, and it's at home, right? So Bryant-Denny Stadium, not an easy place to play by any stretch of the imagination, but it's been a long damn time since we've seen Bryant-Denny Stadium without Nick Saban.
Yeah, I think that's the thing you touched on. I was going to ask you that. I think the SEC benefits huge by Saban retiring, right? And that's pretty obvious. Yeah. I think like LSU and Brian Kelly, that gives them an opportunity. Ole Miss, who had a tremendous year this year. This is Ole Miss's best record in my lifetime that I can remember. Lane Kiffin, things look pretty good there. If he could put a defense together one of these years, they're going to be up there. They're definitely uber talented offensively. I think teams like Tennessee even benefit from this. Kentucky, they've had a really good offseason so far this year. Missouri, they bring back a majority of their team, and they had a tremendous season this year. So, yeah, the SEC this year I think is going to be crazy. I still think Georgia's probably the top team in the SEC. I think that's pretty obvious, but man, there's a slew of teams now. And I'm not saying Bama's falling off a map. Don't get me wrong. Alabama's not going to fall off a map, but I think it's going to be a lot tougher now with everything going on and the players leaving and the whole 9 yards, right, Christian?
Yeah. And sorry, actually, I think you're right, Chris. That's on me. I mean, this has got me so hyped up. I forgot. The SEC's done away with divisions, right? Yep. So they're doing away with divisions. So that's not, from that standpoint, where it's really relevant. When we're talking about the SEC West, I think it's just, the rivalries that you're going to see, the fact that they're going to probably play LSU every year. They still have to play Auburn, let alone, hey, we're not talking about it. Auburn's quietly having they're having a really good offseason.
Yes, they are.
And Hugh Freeze, we know he can coach. Chris, right now as things sit, who are you more optimistic with? You know what I mean? There was obviously, I think, a gap between Auburn and Alabama, albeit in that Iron Bowl, it wasn't that far apart.
That was a hell of a game.
But where who are you more high on right now with this Kalen DeBoer hire at Alabama? Are you higher on DeBoer year one, or are you higher on Hugh Freeze year two?
This is going to sound crazy, and I know Auburn fans hate me, but I'm going to say Auburn, man. They've had a tremendous offseason so far. I don't think Auburn was, their record didn't show it this year. It was a rough year, but they played some teams really tough. Bama and Georgia, especially. That was the two best games Auburn, I think, basically played all year. As I started the show off, Christian, I'm not uber high on the DeBoer hire. I think it's going to be tough. I think the players moving in and out is going to be tough until he finds whose quarterback's going to be, whether that is Milroe, whether it is Will Rogers, it could be somebody else, you name it. Auburn, to me, has got a little stability going. Auburn's a tough place to play. I think they're going to be a lot better this year. Auburn was kind of funny. They actually had a decent defense most of the year. It's the more problems are on the offensive side of the ball. They couldn't move it. Your boy from Michigan State, what's his name, Peyton Thorne or whatever, that was rough this year. But I'm actually higher, and I expect more out of Auburn this year. I'm not saying Auburn's going to have a better record than Bama. Would you go that far, Christian, this coming year? I know we're not doing record predictions yet, but it's early. But would you go out on that limb, or are you going to bring a little Auburn schedule up for me here?
Well, let's take a look at their schedule. Looking at what they're, again, I'm not gonna, let's just look at this: Alabama, A&M, Cal, New Mexico, and Arkansas. Those should be wins just off the rip, right? Just from talent alone, getting Peyton Thorne back. They got Walker White. I think it's his name, Walter White.
Yeah, there you go. Yep.
Ironically, was that Breaking Bad? They got the Breaking Bad at quarterback there. So, but he was a talented kid. those should be pretty good games. Really, the Arkansas, I'm not going to say they're going to be a slouch. I like Sam Pittman as a coach, so it'll be interesting to see. But last year they were not good. Oklahoma and then Georgia, Missouri, and then at Kentucky. I mean, that's a brutal stretch right there for Auburn. But then after that, it lightens up a little bit. Vandy, UL Monroe, and then they get Texas A&M at home. Mike Elko, kind of first-year coach over there at Texas A&M. I don't know. You know what I mean? I don't know what to expect from Auburn this year. I think they'll be better than they were last year. What did they finish last year? 5? No, they were 6.
Did they win 6 games? I think they were in a bowl game, weren't they? Or am I wrong on that?
They were what, 6 and 7 last year? I think
something like that.
Yeah. So, well, hell, I got them pulled up right here.
Yeah,
I can just tell you.
Say if you click on it, they're 6 and 7. Yeah.
Yeah. So they were 6 and 7 last year. 7-8 wins this year for Auburn, possibly 9 wins. That's not out of the picture for me, especially how they played some of those teams. Like they played Alabama, they played Georgia really close, I thought, last year. As crazy as it is to say, I think Auburn's one of those teams that, like, the bigger the game, the better they played. The worse the competition, the worse they played.
Well, what was that game, New Mexico State, where they got beat like 40-17 right before the Bama game? Wasn't that right?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of embarrassing, honestly. I think that quarterback, their quarterback just said, "Get the fuck off me, son." That's what he said. And they were like, "Oh no!" They started getting all pissed off. But yeah.
I want to flip the script here. Let's click on Washington. Let's see what the schedule is for them next year. I haven't really looked into schedules much. I know we're not talking about that a ton, but while we got these guys pulled up here, I want to kind of see what they're moving to the Big Ten. The Big Ten has no divisions either coming up this year. Which I think is good for the Big Ten, so nobody has to watch that shitty Big Ten West anymore play itself out and put teams like Iowa and Purdue in there and Wisconsin. But I think Washington's got Oregon again. Yes, they do. That's kind of their rivalry game at the end of the year there.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's a favorable schedule for them, right? They got Weber State, Eastern Michigan, Washington State, Northwestern, Northwestern and Rutgers, they're kind of surprisingly decent teams, right? Now, I think keeping DeBoer and having Will Rogers and probably reloading, it's probably not going to be all that close of a game. I would think that, in hindsight, looking at what could have been this year. But, with a new coaching staff and God only knows who they're going to have at quarterback and what that offense and what the rest of the team is going to look like, Northwestern and Rutgers could be a difficult game for them.
Yeah, I would still lean Washington regardless, unless everybody falls off the map for Washington, but just because they're more talented. Nothing against Northwestern, the freaking season Braun had this year. And then obviously what Shiano's doing at Rutgers is he's solid. But ironically, though, we get a matchup on the 5th of the national title game. Going to be 2 completely overhauled rosters. Michigan loses a ton off their team too, but that'll be kind of interesting there. I didn't know they played each other this coming year. That's kind of cool.
The game's at Michigan, so I'd probably lean with them. Iowa, Iowa, you would think is probably going to be pretty good on defense. I don't know what either one of these offenses, truthfully, is going to look like by that time. So it'll be interesting to see. Then they play at Indiana, and then they kind of have a little bit of a murderer's row there to kind of go on. They play USC, Penn State, UCLA, and at Oregon. So it'll be interesting, man. It'll be very interesting.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I like I said, the Washington schedule next year, that's going to be tough. Big Ten obviously is going to be tough next year with the whole addition of all these teams coming in. Like I keep laughing and joking, I'm a Nebraska fan. Nebraska's going to end up be playing on Tuesday nights against Purdue and stuff like that with all these good teams coming in over here if we don't get our shit together. So got a couple people jumping in the chat here.
Yeah, we'll read that there for us.
I'll let you read that one off, Christian.
Oh, okay. Bad Jerk D says, bad hire for sure. Only reason DeBoer was in a championship game is because he had Penix and never faced a top 50 passing defense until they met Michigan. We all know how well DeBoer did. Yeah, I agree with you. By the way, congrats to Michigan. I'm assuming this gentleman is a Michigan fan there. Well-deserved victory you guys had. Congratulations. Yeah. It feels good to be at the top of college football.
Yeah, I want to add to this. I haven't said this. I took a lot of shit from the Michigan fans this year, but thank you, Michigan, for winning a national title and propping the Big Ten up there a little bit. We needed that. I do root for the Big Ten as a conference. Thank you for getting this one. It wasn't Ohio State once, so I do appreciate that. Hats off to Michigan this year, though.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think DeBoer, like I said, DeBoer, and we're going to grade this higher here in a couple minutes, but
yeah.
DeBoer, to me, he's a good coach. I mean, obviously the record speaks for itself, but we haven't seen him do this at that level yet, right, Chris? I mean, I would have been more interested to see what he did in the Big Ten, first.
Yeah.
See what was that first year like in the Big Ten. To me, the Pac-12 for years has been, sort of the punching bag of the Power Five. I mean, you could make the argument the Big 12 was better than the Pac-12 leading up to this year. And now all of a sudden, I think this year they had a really good year this year. But also, DeBoer had, a couple years to get this roster sort of ready, and he had some time to be able to do what he did. It was a very senior-led team, if I'm not mistaken. They were going to have a lot of turnover anyways. So it would have been interesting to see what they were going to do, I think, going into the Big Ten this year.
Yeah, I want to add to that because this gentleman's right. I mean, Penix was probably the biggest piece of this whole thing for DeBoer. And like I said, I think Caleb DeBoer's a good coach. Kalen DeBoer, I keep calling Caleb. But Michael Penix was probably the biggest piece, right? Pulling him from Indiana to come play for him. The work they did with that kid had a hell of a year. I mean, stat-wise, it was insane. Unfortunately, that title game, he did run into a defense that was very, very good, and he looked rattled. I mean, I said that when we came on a couple days ago about it. I don't know. Like I said, the turnover at Washington is going to be substantial, and it's going to be tough. And I would have liked to seen, like you made a really good point, Christian, it would have been nice to see him coach in the Big Ten for a couple of years, kind of see where it is, because I think the Big Ten, just far as sustainability goes, has been a better conference with some tougher defenses, and see how his coaching scheme would have matched up against Michigan on a yearly basis, or Ohio State in their defense, even Penn State. I know we laugh about Penn State in the offense, but they do usually have a solid defense. So yeah, I agree with you, Christian. I do.
Reflect the sun, by the way. Shout out to the Husky fans there. We appreciate that. And what a couple of days. Chris, I agree, man. I mean, they were talking about this a little bit, and you got to think about it. It's been a weird, I don't want to say weird, but it's been a very up and down 5 or 6 days for Washington, right? Last Monday they were playing, for the national title and a shot at immortality on the line there. Now that game didn't go their way, right? And we know that. And then a few days later, Saban retires, and now all of a sudden Kalen DeBoer, their head coach that got him to the promised land, is gone. A lot of the roster is gone. Obviously, they graduated and/or are declaring for the draft. So Washington is kind of left out in the cold here. They were a team that I think before all this kicked off, we had said, hey, because they got DeBoer, because they have all these pieces, they have a shot, and assuming Harbaugh does jump ship and goes to the NFL, knowing what Ryan Day and Ohio State have been, they had a shot. You know what I mean? I think they had a shot at competing with Oregon too.
Yeah, no, it's like I said, I feel bad for Washington because they were one of the coolest stories of the year, man. Everybody wrote them off. I did include it against Oregon both times. It was a great story, and like I said, I think it was an awesome thing for college football. I actually think this year's playoffs was awesome. I thought the first 2 games of the playoffs were amazing. The Bama Michigan game was an old school '90s smash mouth football game. We talked about Texas and the Washington game. Those 2 teams were very similar. Just 2 elite offenses as well going at it. That was fun to watch. I mean, it was better than the previous couple of years, right, Christian? I mean, I know the TCU upset over Michigan was crazy, 2 years ago, but man, we saw what happened with Georgia blowing the hell out of TCU in the championship game. And I mean, this year was awesome for college football. I'm not going to touch on the next year's, I'm a huge component of this 12-team playoff, but sorry, I didn't mean to click on that there, but yeah, I think that I feel bad, I guess, is my point for Washington. It's got to kind of suck because I know we have a lot of Husky fans on this channel, man, and they love Kalen DeBoer, and they should. And it's got to be kind of heartbreaking. He's only there for a couple of years, take you to the promised land, like you said, Christian. Had a shot at immortality, going 15-0, and come up short. And now you're left with questions, right? New conference next year. It's going to be tough regardless for Washington going forward.
No, I think you said it exactly right, Chris. I mean, it is going to be really tough for Washington, but they're going to rebound. I mean, Washington in and of itself, they've always been a solid program, I felt like. They have periods where, before DeBoer was there, I mean, they were 4-8. Was it Jimmy Lake? I think after Chris Peterson was kind of the guy there. So, but I mean, they have periods where they're. I mean, you got to think a couple years before that, Chris Peterson had them back in the playoffs, right? Mm-hmm. Back in the 90s, they were winning. They won a national title. So Washington itself, I mean, it's a program. Is it Bama? Is it some of these dynasties we've seen? No, but it's a damn good job to have, and they're going to be okay. They're gonna figure something out. I think if they get a Grubbs or a Pete Carroll to sort of get them to that next level, get them integrated into the Big Ten, I think they're going to be okay. Shifting the tide back to the Crimson Tide here. Good wordplay there. Thank you. By gosh, the resident geriatric down there, everybody, Chris Vaca. Let's give him a round of applause.
Let's go, Chris!
Oh man, yeah. But this is what we were talking about earlier. Bama's cornerback coach, top recruiter. This was their top recruiter apparently. Is Georgia bound. So the rich get richer here. Let's jump back here a little bit and kind of look at some of this. Let's see here. Reflect on the plays that the players, I'm assuming, the DeBoer and Grubbs developed with the wide receivers that were already in-house was amazing. So basically what they're saying is a lot of these guys were already on staff. I think Reflect the Sun said, let me find this here. The big knock, and this is something we've touched on, was the recruiting. Yeah. He still, he still couldn't get a top 20 recruiting class. And when you go to a place like Bama, even if they were going to the Big Ten, I still think you have to be able. They finished this year, by the way, with a number 41 ranked recruiting class, right? And I think they were like 20, 30th, something like that in transfer portals, which, in the transfer portal class, which that's not very good by transfer portal class standards, right? Right. There were some other teams that were well above them that you're like, damn, I can't believe that team was above them. But I think when we look at this, Chris, you can't go to Bama and not have a top 10, 15 recruiting class. We touched on it before we got on the show. I know we've talked about this since the news has broken down. To go to a place like Bama and have, let's just say the 23rd best recruiting class in the country, they will fall off the face of this earth in the SEC. There is no questions in my mind. DeBoer can be the best coach in the world, but you're not going to be able to develop talent and go up against the likes of LSU, to go up against the likes of Georgia, maybe even, dare I say, possibly Texas A&M that has more money than they know what to do with, right? I mean, we saw that with Jimbo Fisher. They can buy just about whoever they want to. Now, I think Elko is going to have to come in, and he's another guy that's done a lot with a little, right? That's what makes this whole thing so interesting to me is the SEC from a looking out at the horizon a little bit, has a ton of really good, coaches that I think could end up making this thing a lot more interesting as we go forward into the 12-team playoff format, right?
Right. And I mean, what you say, though, that's what Saban did best, right, was recruit. I mean, the guy had 5 stars sitting behind 5 stars for years, right? I mean, was there ever a year where Saban and Bama didn't finish in the top 5, Christian, in recruiting? I mean, that I remember there isn't. I mean, they're always right there, right? That's going to be tough. And this gentleman mentioned it, about DeBoer. Can he recruit? I said this earlier before some of you guys jumped on. Not a lot of players come from the West Coast to play for Alabama. There's very few on that roster. I think how he establishes some sort of recruiting portal pipeline down there is going to be huge, whether it's from Texas, Louisiana, Georgia, Florida. That's where predominantly a lot of those kids go down and play for the SEC. That's going to be huge. And we're going to have to, some of the offseason is going to tell that too. But I'm with you. That's why I don't think this is a great hire for Alabama. Like I said, I'm not hating on Alabama. I just don't. I'm not hating on Kalen DeBoer either. I mean, both things can be true. I think he's a good coach. I just don't know if this was the right fit overall.
Chris, you said it. Let's segue here. What's your grade? Grading this hire, what are you going to grade it?
I would say I would give this a C-. And I want to talk about this for a second. The other aspect is, well, who the hell were they going to get? You know what I mean? I've talked about this. Nobody wants to follow Nick Saban. Nobody wants to follow a legend at anything. It's damn near impossible to replicate the guy before you. Especially somebody is well known and renowned. And I've said this before. Nick Saban's the greatest college coach I've ever seen, and I think he's probably the greatest college coach of all time. and that's debatable. And you can let me know in the comments and tell me how I'm wrong. That's fine. But I give it a C minus. I like I said, there were guys out there. I know they wanted Dan Lanning. Dan Lanning said, no, I'm comfortable in Oregon, and that's great. I think there were a few other names that they probably maybe could have tried, and I'm never going to know the whole story. We'll never know who they all reached out to, whether this was done weeks ago. Who knows? I don't believe everything I read online, and neither should you guys. But I give it a C minus strictly because of the ties and even the personality. And I don't know Kalen DeBoer, but from what I see, I think he's a great guy. I just don't know if he's going to be able to match that intensity that Nick Saban was an intense guy. Christian, you would agree, right? Especially in his early years. Kirby Smart's an intense guy. Dan Lanning is an intense guy. Kalen DeBoer is more relaxed, and that's fine to be that way. There's great coaches like that. Tom Osborne was a fairly relaxed guy at Nebraska here. I just don't know, though, what Bama expects and that fan base expects. It's going to be tough, and I think they probably could have – I know they couldn't wait forever on this either. This had to be in a hurry to find somebody, especially this late in the year. So – Christian, I want to hear your thoughts before I rattle on there about it. What would you grade this honestly? What would you give this higher?
Again, just keeping it a buck with everybody here, and let us know in the comments what you would grade this higher.
Yeah.
That's the big thing is everything. Everyone's going to have their own opinion on it. Me personally, I'm going to give it a C+.
Okay.
The reason why I give it a C+, Chris, is we're thinking about this. An A higher for me would be somebody with championship pedigree at this level. Now, the guy has 3 NAIA titles. I think we've touched on that to death, right? Yep. He doesn't have, as a head coach, the big national title at this level that you want, right? He's had really, and let's be honest here, he's had a couple of really good seasons, at this level, right? He got his team to the championship game. And like we said, it was one really good quarter away from possibly beating Michigan and winning a national title, right? And that's the reality of the situation. So we got a team in Washington that, we weren't really sure about to the playoffs and was able to beat Texas. He was able to beat he was able to beat Steve Sarkisian. He was able to beat Dan Lanning, both guys that a lot of people thought were above him on this list, for this job. He was undefeated against those guys, which is crazy to me. He's played them more than once. So it's a C+ because of the recruiting, right? We're not sure. He hasn't really been able to put the recruiting side of things together. Now, the other side of why I'm saying it's a C+ is I feel like, his record speaks for itself. He's got a great record, and he is able to get a lot out of, not a whole lot as far as all that stuff is concerned, right? He gets a lot out of the talent that he had. Now, as people are letting us know, hey, Washington had, they had some of these guys in place when he took over, right? It was just about being able to utilize them and get them in the right position. And you go out and you get a Michael Penix there to make that difference. For me personally, like we said, I think it's going to be one of those things where how does he do on defense? Some of the guys in the comment, some of the people in the comment have already let us know, hey, defensively, Washington wasn't good. We knew that, I think, last year. They were a little better this year, if you can believe that, than they were the year prior, his first full season there. It's you can't not play defense in the SEC. We saw it this year with LSU and Ole Miss. And if you do that, that will not live up to the Alabama standard.
True. No, you're not wrong. And you speak about that. And we talk about it. Christian and I are huge components of defense, right? That's just I'm one of these people. I would rather watch Alabama play Michigan 100 times simply just because that some people are going to say that was kind of a boring game. I love defensive games like that, but the SEC has been predominantly known as great defense down there, and that's the other question. I forgot to add that with DeBoer. Can you get Bama's defense to the standard that Nick Saban has set there? They've been great, right? And people are going to say, well, Kirby Smart was a big part of that, and yeah, sure he was. But LSU could put up a ton of points. Missouri's going to be able to put up a ton of points. They bring back a ton of offense next year. We talk about Ole Miss in that offense. Tennessee with the new freshman quarterback who looked really, really, really good against an Iowa defense that we all thought was elite in the bowl game. That's a huge question this year for Bama and Kalen DeBoer, in my opinion, is the defensive side of the ball. Alabama's hung its hat on defenses a lot. It's won a lot of national titles, too, in the past.
Yeah, I agree. And the caveat to this is, where is this hire going to be at, in 3 or 4 years? Are we going to look back and say, damn, I can't believe Bama got the next, Nick Saban, right? Or are we going to look back and say, damn, I can't believe Alabama got the next Brian Harsin, who lasted a year and a half and was fired after they lost to, I don't know, a Florida with a first year coach next year, or Vanderbilt, something crazy like that. I mean, that's what makes college football so good, and so interesting is anything can happen at this point, right? I mean, this hire could go one of two ways. Because I'm going to tell you right now, Bama will not accept mediocrity. That is one thing that fan base will not tolerate. Let's be honest for a second here. You could go 8-4 at Washington. You could go 9-3 at Washington. They're not going to, they're not going to say, man, we need to fire him. You could do that even in the Big Ten, and it still would be, hey, he's doing a damn good job. Let's keep him. At Alabama, you can start going 7-5, 8-4, 9-3 during the regular season, and there's going to be some issues, and they will automatically start moving on from you sooner rather than later.
Christian, I'm going to say this. I mean, the expectation at Alabama is it's not make the playoffs, and I know we're going to a 12 team next year. It's compete for a national title, right? Anything outside of that is not a successful year. It has to be. I know this from being a Husker fan. You know this being a Georgia fan. Your guys' goals to put, you're not going to call this year a failure for Georgia, right?
No,
but your guys'
well, time out. Sorry, you caught me off guard there. I am going to call this year a failure because I think the expectation now, in the same way that Alabama, has that same expectation, the same way that Ohio State has that expectation of winning championships, it is always a bust, right? Yep. There's really two things you got to do when you take a job like Ohio State, Michigan now that they've won a championship, Alabama, Georgia, some of these teams, and that is, number one, you got to beat your rivals, right? If you're Ohio State, you got to beat Michigan. If you're Michigan, you got to beat Ohio State, 100%. Right? If you're Alabama, you got to beat Georgia. If you're Georgia, you got to beat Alabama, right? You could throw Auburn in there as well because I think Auburn, in a weird way, is one of those teams that they play with them. They play with both those teams. The second thing you got to do is you have to have success, in the postseason. And especially with this expanded, postseason that we're getting ready to see, if you're Kalen DeBoer, you're 9-3, you sneak into the playoffs somehow, and you get waxed by a Georgia or a Michigan or an Ohio State, it's not going to be a good look. You know what I mean? Basically, what I'm trying to say is, if a large portion of this roster jumps ship and they end up in the portal, and then you end up with a completely different looking Alabama team next year, and they limp their way into the playoffs, and they end up playing Utah, for example, and Utah out physicals them, and they end up losing to Utah. You want to talk about this grade now that we're talking about right now, Chris, going from a C+ or a B or an A or whatever you want to grade it to now probably being, a failing grade. I could see it. I could see a world where that happens because, Bama, just like so many other programs, they're a victim of their own success. We talk about that a lot here on the show, is you can become a victim of your own success where, 8-9 wins, it's not good enough. Not at Alabama, not when the standard is, 6 national titles, under one coach since 2008.
Right. And I could speak on this. As a Husker fan, I'm 38 years old. I remember the 90s, right? We won 3 out of 4.
Yeah.
Tom Osborne retires, 97. We bring in Frank Solich, played for Nebraska, played under Tom Osborne. I remember when that hire happened. I was like 13, but I remember everybody was happy. Like, oh, Solich is fine. He coached under Osborne for 20 years. He knows the system. And believe it or not, Frank Solich was a really good coach. He took us to the national title against probably one of the greatest teams ever assembled in 02 Miami. We got our doors blown off. But we were winning about 10 games a year, right? From the 12, 11, 12 that Osborne had us there with. And then it became, well, that's not enough, right? Then we go out and get, Callahan. Now we drop to sub 6, 7, 8 win seasons. Now the expectation is, shit, now we got to get back to winning, getting back to bowl games. Well, we get Bo Pelini. Then Bo Pelini's knock for 9 or 10 years was, oh, you just can't win the big one. 8, 9 wins isn't enough. There's a game that's being played, man, and that's with the fan base, and it's tough. It's impossible to ever make everybody happy because that's exactly what happened here. And I think that could happen to Bama. You mentioned something before we started the show. Bama had a span there, Christian, of 27 years where they won 1 national title. I mean, that was it. Yeah. What was Georgia before Kirby Smart, Christian?
41 years and a lot of Herschel Walker highlights with Larry Munson on the call there. Basically is what it was. I mean, and before Kirby Smart took over, let's go back and let's revisit that, right? They weren't marginally average. No, Georgia wasn't. They were a lot of 9-10 win seasons there
God,
with under Mark Richt. And I mean, it was great, right? It was great because you knew you were good enough to win 9-10 games a year. You knew you were good enough to get to the dance, but you weren't good enough to go undefeated. You weren't good enough to beat Bama. And we talked about it, right? Subtract Nick Saban in this hypothetical world that we wish we lived in as Georgia fans. Georgia would have, since the turn of the 2000s, they would probably have another 2 championships, right? So they would have 4 championships there. Mark Richt probably would have done it. I think it was 2013, the year Alabama waxed Notre Dame, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, yep.
In that championship game, Georgia and Alabama played in the SEC championship game, and it came down to like a goal line play where the guy caught it in bounds and basically got tackled and the clock expired. I would like to think, based off that, Georgia probably would have beat Notre Dame in that game, and then obviously the championship game where your favorite quarterback for your damn Fins there on, what was it, third and however long, second however long, 26, ended up, hitting a bomb on us. So you take those 2 things away, I'd like to think Georgia probably has another 2 championships this decade. So, but you could play the shoulda, coulda, woulda game all day long, right? Without Saban there, it'll be interesting to see what DeBoer does. I mean, he's not Saban and he's not Saban. Right? And Saban's not DeBoer. So it'll be interesting to see kind of what they do there.
No, I agree.
Let's see here. I'm going to see something real quick. Yeah, Des Ricks, by the way, he was a 5-star right here. Hobson says Des Ricks, the 5-star from Bama, has entered the portal cornerback. That's something we had touched on a little bit ago. We saw it. And I think he was going to be a big part of that, if I'm not mistaken. With Arnold out and some of the other pieces of that secondary sort of hitting the portal or declaring for the draft, he was going to be a big name that was probably going to be floated around there. So, interestingly enough, I think this is just getting started for Bama. It wouldn't shock me if, we get into the spring and we have even more departures there. Obviously after the spring. Right now, we may see a little flurry here and there. We may see some big pieces start to fall. But I think after spring, that's where we're going to see a bigger mass exodus. Because like Chris said, I mean, right now classes are kind of going. Yep. It's kind of late. A lot of pieces have already moved, but after spring, after signing day, that's when I think it's going to be more mass exodus for Alabama.
Yeah,
Billy Rice.
There you go. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's going to be really interesting to see who do they pick for their defensive coordinator. A lot of guys said it was T. Rob, the guy that now is at Georgia, their top recruiter / defensive backs coach. I'm assuming Saban will probably help give some names because Saban's probably going to be his right hand guy to help get him integrated into this position, right, Chris?
Yeah, I would think so. You would have to, because Saban has so many ties to coaching and all the great coaches he's hired for a year or two, and then his tree is crazy. By the way, it's Sark, it's Kiffin, it's all these guys. I'm assuming Saban's got some connections. I would assume Saban would help DeBoer out too, right? I don't care what you say. I think Bama or Saban will always love Bama and still be a fan. I mean, I actually watched an interview with Saban the other day when they asked him a bunch of questions about it, and he did say that. He goes, "Man, I love football. I'll always love football. I'm going to be doing something with football." And of course, ESPN jumps in there and says, "Well, we could probably get you a spot, for being an analyst or whatever." And he goes, "I'd love that, So he's going to be around in the game. I mean, especially when you've been coaching for as long as Saban, that game never leaves you, man. He loves football. It's quite clear. So it wouldn't surprise me, and he loves Bama. So it wouldn't surprise me if Bama does pull off a big coaching on the defensive side of the ball."
Yeah, I agree with you. Like I said, I mean, but don't say they're in the portal yet because he's still talking to the guys. Well, because some of the guys we're talking about, like Ricks, he is in the portal. Like it's on 24/7. You can look at that. And I think maybe what he's talking about is when we're saying, hey, there might be more of an exodus coming. Is you know what? You're absolutely right. We don't know what's going to happen. He could retain everybody from here on out, or half the damn roster could end up jumping ship, right? We don't know. I'm just purely speculating because a lot of guys, when they commit to Bama, they're committing for Nick Saban, right? Now, Nick Saban isn't the head football coach. He's an ancillary part of it. He's going to have his hand pretty much in a lot of these different moves that we see. C.E. Ford says it too right here. Coach Saban is still there. Yes, he has an office there. Yes, he probably, personally had a big part as to why Kalen DeBoer is there. And there's a lot of things that are moving on there. Saban's still going to probably have a very strong pull there. Like Chris says, even if he goes to work for ESPN or College Game Day, you know what I mean, next year. I guarantee you this offseason, Saban is going to do everything he can to make sure this program is in as good of a spot as it possibly can be.
Right. I mean, look at what Saban did for that program in the 20 years he was there, or 17 years, whatever it was. I mean, it's crazy. Bama really wasn't known until he got there. I mean, you don't have the Bear Bryant or the Bear Bryant days anymore, but I mean, that 30 years there, they didn't win a damn title except for one, I think, in 92 or whatever year it was. So also you got to look at what he did at LSU. He propped that program up and it's still great today. Before he got there, LSU really wasn't much. And that just tells me the success of Saban and wherever he's been. He was good in the NFL under Belichick as a coordinator. He's been good everywhere he's been. Michigan State, people forget he coached there. I watched 95 Nebraska beat the hell out of him. And that was a young Nick Saban, but he propped up Michigan State. And let's be honest, Michigan State's got usually a pretty decent football program over there most years. So, yeah, I don't know, man. He's going to have his hand in the game somewhere. Nobody will convince me that he doesn't. He's always been a huge advocate of college football and any of the programs that he's been at.
I'll say this, my final thoughts on it, Chris, before we probably end up getting off here is as much as it probably sucks for Alabama fans, and as much as it kind of probably sucks a little bit for college football, in a way it's good because it's breaking up the monopoly, right? It's breaking up the monopoly. And I think everything that's been done with the NIL, the transfer portal, all that stuff was leading to this, right? Where it was designed in a way to, up viewership because now we're sort of evenly distributing the talent. Now you're still going to have, Georgia and Ohio State and, some of these other schools out there that are going to have a monopoly on the sport, make no mistake about it. But breaking up Alabama, in a way, and Saban retiring is going to make it a little more interesting, I feel like, in this new updated landscape of college football.
Yeah, and it eventually was coming. Saban said it. He goes, man, I couldn't coach forever. And the reason why he quit, and I believe him when he says this, he said that I couldn't promise kids anymore because they would ask me, how long are you going to be here at Alabama? He goes, I'm in my 70s. He goes, I can't work till 2 a.m. and get up at 6 anymore. I'm getting old. He kept mentioning that. He just like, how can I make that promise to a kid that I'm going to be here in 3 or 4 years when I don't even know if I want to be here in 3 or 4 years? So I agree with you, Christian, 100% on that one, man.
Yeah, a couple more things and we'll jump off here. CE4 says Coach Saban is the best as a Bama fan. I'm looking forward to the press conference in an hour. You know what? Hey, I'm going to agree with you. Coach Saban is the best college football coach of all time. A lot of people throw Tom Osborne out there, Bobby Bowden. No, Saban to me is the GOAT.
Yeah, I agree.
Rich Gamer says I'm a Bama fan, and I think this is the second best hire. Saban was one. Yeah, look, actually, you probably want to say third, right? Because it's probably Nick Saban, then Bear Bryant, then if you were really right. So that's what I think is, hey, as long as Bama fans like the hire, that's all that matters, right? That's all that really matters. Because hey, the rest of the college football, they're going to hate on you guys, and no matter what, they're going to throw dirt on the name. They're going to tell you it's not Saban, it's not this, it's not that. And, we're going to see how this hire shakes out in a couple years. It's going to take a couple years to really know whether this is a good hire or not. Now, the problem is obviously at Alabama, a couple years you may not have if you're not successful out the gate. So there's a lot of pressure with it.
Yeah, there was going to be a lot of pressure regardless of who they hired in this whole thing. Yeah. That's like I said, when you follow a legend, probably the greatest coach of all time, it doesn't matter. And you're right. There's a lot of people that hate Bama. The SEC's happy as a whole. I can tell you that. Finally, somebody's like, hey, well, there could be another team up there with Georgia, LSU, Ole Miss that all gives those teams a chance to compete. And they don't, like I said, and I don't want to say Alabama's going anywhere. That's the thing. I don't want people to take it that way either. They're not. I think Bama's going to be right in the running. It's just that Nick Saban was a huge piece of that. He's the one that built that program back up.
I agree with you, Chris. Well, guys, thank you for joining us for the lunch hour here with the I-80 boys. We're going to be back on probably whenever some big news drops right now. This is kind of the dead part of college football. We were supposed to be off for 2 months, but then, well, the whole college football landscape got shook up. We hope you guys have a great weekend. If you're in an area where there's a lot of snow, please be safe, and we'll talk to you guys a little later on.